They called her a traitor, a coward, and a disgrace to the uniform. Lieutenant Alice Davis, a 23-year-old communications specialist from the rolling hills of Wales, was facing court-martial for allegedly leaking classified intelligence to enemy forces. Her own commanding officers wanted her imprisoned, her fellow soldiers avoided her like a plague, and her family back home received death threats from strangers who believed the headlines. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. But on a sunny Tuesday morning in the mountains of Eastern Europe, this traitor would make a decision that would save 500 Allied troops from certain annihilation, a sacrifice so profound that it would rewrite military history and transform her from the most hated woman in the army to its most unlikely hero. The morning briefing at Forward Operating Base Blackwood began like any other, but Alice Davis could feel the weight of suspicious glances following her every movement. At 23, she was one of the youngest communications specialists ever deployed to the volatile Eastern European theater, where Allied forces were locked in a complex conflict with insurgent groups backed by hostile foreign powers. The base, nestled in a valley surrounded by pine-covered mountains, hummed with the constant activity of a military operation under pressure. Alice sat in the back corner of the briefing tent, her laptop open and headset resting around her neck like a technological collar that marked her as different from the infantry soldiers around her. While they carried rifles and spoke in the rough vernacular of combat veterans, she carried encryption keys and spoke in the precise language of data transmission protocols. Her role was critical. She managed all digital communications between Blackwood and command headquarters, ensuring that intelligence flowed securely and operations remained coordinated across a front that stretched for hundreds of miles. The contrast between Alice and her fellow soldiers was striking in more ways than just equipment. Where most of the base personnel were hardened men and women in their late 20s and 30s, Alice possessed an almost ethereal quality that seemed out of place in the harsh military environment. Her auburn hair, when not constrained by regulations, caught the morning sunlight streaming through the tent's opening, and her green eyes held an intensity that suggested depths of thought and emotion that others found unsettling. She was brilliant at her job, perhaps too brilliant for her own good. Colonel Marcus Thorne, a weathered veteran of 3 previous conflicts, stood at the front of the tent addressing the assembled personnel. His voice carried the authority of decades in uniform, but Alice noticed how his eyes never quite met her when he spoke about operational security. The distance wasn't new, it had been growing for weeks, ever since the first whispers began about potential security breaches in their communications network. Intel indicates increased enemy activity in sectors 7 through 12, Thorne announced, pointing to a digital map displayed on the main screen. Alice's fingers unconsciously tightened around her coffee cup as she recognized the implicit accusation. The enemy seemed to be anticipating Allied movements with uncanny accuracy, and as the person responsible for securing their communications, she was the natural suspect. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the base's intelligence officer, took over the briefing with a presentation about intercepted enemy communications. Alice listened with growing unease as Mitchell described sophisticated encryption methods and communication protocols that seemed suspiciously similar to Allied standards. The implication was clear. Someone with intimate knowledge of their systems was sharing information with hostile forces. As the briefing concluded and personnel began filing out, Alice remained seated, ostensibly reviewing her notes but actually trying to process the mounting evidence against her. She had noticed the anomalies in communication patterns weeks ago and had been conducting her own investigation, trying to trace the source of the apparent leaks. But her proactive approach had only made her appear more suspicious to those already inclined to doubt her. The irony was devastating. Alice had grown up in a small Welsh village where her father had served as a Royal Army Communications Corps veteran, inspiring her to follow in his footsteps. She had excelled in every technical training program, graduated at the top of her class in cryptographic systems, and volunteered for the most challenging deployments. Her dedication to the mission was absolute, her technical skills were unmatched, and her loyalty to her fellow soldiers was unwavering. Yet none of that seemed to matter when suspicion began to cloud judgment. The hierarchy at Forward Operating Base Blackwood operated on principles that had been established long before Alice's arrival, and those principles left little room for a young woman whose brilliance made others uncomfortable. Colonel Thorne commanded with the traditional military mindset that valued proven experience over innovative thinking, and his inner circle consisted entirely of officers who had earned their positions through conventional career paths. Alice, with her rapid promotion through technical merit and her unconventional approach to problem-solving, represented something foreign to their established order. Major William Crawford, the base operations officer, epitomized the institutional resistance that Alice faced daily. A man in his late 40s who had worked his way up through infantry ranks, Crawford viewed Alice's technical expertise with a mixture of resentment and suspicion. During planning sessions, he would consistently defer to the opinions of male communications specialists with lesser qualifications, often interrupting Alice when she attempted to contribute insights about enemy communication capabilities or vulnerability assessments. The decision-making process at Blackwood followed a rigid chain of command that excluded Alice from critical strategic discussions despite her unique position as the person most familiar with both Allied and captured enemy communication systems. When intelligence officers needed technical analysis of intercepted enemy signals, they would route requests through multiple intermediaries rather than consulting directly with Alice. When patrol commanders required assessments of communication security in hostile territories, they would rely on outdated protocols rather than seeking her expertise. This systematic exclusion became more pronounced as the security situation deteriorated. Enemy forces seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Allied movements, arriving at locations minutes after patrols had passed, avoiding supply convoys by impossibly narrow margins, and launching attacks that suggested intimate knowledge of base defensive arrangements. Each successful enemy operation increased the pressure to find an explanation, and Alice's unique access to sensitive information made her an increasingly attractive target for suspicion. The social dynamics within the base reflected and reinforced the official hierarchy. Alice found herself eating meals alone as conversations stopped when she approached tables in the mess hall. Her roommate, Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, began requesting schedule changes to avoid sharing quarters. Even the enlisted communications technicians who had previously sought her guidance on complex technical problems started maintaining professional distance, unwilling to associate with someone whose loyalty was increasingly questioned. Colonel Thorne's staff meetings became exercises in coded accusations and careful word choice. When discussing communication security protocols, officers would reference internal threats and potential compromise from within. When analyzing enemy capabilities, they would speculate about insider knowledge and unauthorized information sharing. Alice would sit through these meetings, taking notes and maintaining professional composure, while understanding that she was the unnamed subject of their growing paranoia. The most painful aspect of this systematic isolation was how it undermined Alice's ability to effectively perform her duties. Her requests for additional security clearances to investigate communication anomalies were denied. Her recommendations for enhanced encryption protocols were dismissed as unnecessarily complex. Her analysis of enemy communication patterns was treated as potentially compromised intelligence rather than valuable insight. The very expertise that had made her invaluable was now viewed as evidence of possible treachery. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base's senior intelligence analyst, perhaps understood Alice's situation better than anyone else, having faced her own challenges as a woman in a male-dominated field. However, even Hayes maintained careful distance, unwilling to risk her own career by appearing to support someone under growing suspicion. During their few private conversations, Hayes would speak in careful generalities about the challenges facing military personnel under investigation, never directly addressing Alice's situation, but making it clear that survival required absolute compliance with official protocols and complete avoidance of any action that could be misconstrued. The investigation into potential security breaches followed procedures designed more to protect institutional interests than to find truth. Rather than conducting a thorough technical analysis of communication systems to identify actual vulnerabilities, the investigation focused on personnel with access to sensitive information. Rather than examining external threats or sophisticated enemy intelligence capabilities, investigators concentrated on internal suspects who could serve as convenient explanations. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. This approach created a feedback loop where Alice's isolation increased her apparent guilt, which justified further isolation and more intensive scrutiny. Her dedication to solving technical problems was interpreted as suspicious interest in sensitive systems. Her emotional responses to accusations were viewed as evidence of guilt rather than natural reactions to injustice. Her attempts to defend herself were characterized as deflection and manipulation rather than legitimate efforts to clear her name. While her colleagues slept, Alice Bavis worked in the shadows of Forward Operating Base Blackwood's communications center, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. The facility hummed with the constant background noise of servers and transmission equipment, creating a technological cocoon where she felt most at home. Here, surrounded by the tools of her trade, Alice pursued an investigation that no one had authorized and few would understand. A methodical analysis of communication patterns that she believed held the key to exposing the real security threat. For months, Alice had been developing her own sophisticated monitoring systems, writing custom software that could analyze data traffic patterns with unprecedented precision. Working during off-duty hours, she had created algorithms that could detect anomalies in communication timing, frequency usage, and routing protocols that standard military software missed entirely. Her approach went far beyond conventional security analysis, incorporating techniques from civilian cybersecurity research and academic cryptographic studies that she pursued in her spare time. The data she was collecting painted a disturbing picture that contradicted the official narrative about security breaches. Rather than evidence of internal leaks, Alice's analysis suggested something far more sophisticated. Enemy forces were using advanced signal intelligence capabilities to intercept and decode Allied communications in real time. Her algorithms detected patterns in enemy response times that indicated they were reading encrypted messages within minutes of transmission, a capability that required technology far beyond what intelligence assessments had attributed to hostile forces. Alice's personal research library had grown to include technical manuals, academic papers, and intelligence reports that she obtained through legitimate channels, but studied with an intensity that exceeded professional requirements. She maintained detailed charts tracking enemy communication signatures, cross-referenced with Allied operational schedules and geographic patterns. Her analysis revealed that enemy forces were not just intercepting communications, but actively manipulating message routing to create false impressions of internal compromise. The sophistication of her investigation would have impressed intelligence professionals, but Alice shared her findings with no one. She understood that her unofficial research would be viewed as further evidence of suspicious activity, rather than dedication to uncovering the truth. Instead, she documented everything meticulously, creating an archive of evidence that she hoped would eventually vindicate her when official investigators reached similar conclusions through their own methods. Her technical skills extended beyond digital analysis into areas that military training rarely emphasized. Alice had taught herself advanced radio frequency analysis, studying how electromagnetic signals behave in the mountainous terrain surrounding Blackwood. She understood how atmospheric conditions affect signal propagation, how enemy forces might exploit geographic features to intercept communications, and how sophisticated adversaries could use signal manipulation techniques to create false indicators of compromise. During her limited free time, Alice practiced skills that seemed unrelated to her official duties, but which she instinctively understood might prove valuable. She studied maps of the surrounding region with the dedication of a geography professor, memorizing elevation patterns, communication tower locations, and potential sites where sophisticated surveillance equipment might be positioned. Her analysis extended to weather patterns, understanding how atmospheric conditions could affect electronic warfare capabilities and communication security. Alice's emotional investment in solving the security crisis went beyond professional obligation. She felt personally responsible for every successful enemy operation, every Allied casualty that resulted from compromised communications. Her colleagues might question her loyalty, but Alice knew that her dedication to protecting Allied forces exceeded that of anyone else on the base. This sense of responsibility drove her to work longer hours, to push her analysis deeper, and to accept personal risks that others would consider unreasonable. The loneliness of her situation only intensified her focus. Without social connections to distract her or colleagues to share the burden of investigation, Alice poured all her emotional energy into her research. She developed theories about enemy capabilities that were months ahead of official intelligence assessments, identified vulnerabilities in Allied communication systems that standard security protocols failed to address, and created countermeasure recommendations that no one would read because they came from a suspected traitor. Her quarters became a secondary workspace filled with technical diagrams, signal analysis charts, and theoretical frameworks for understanding enemy intelligence operations. Alice transformed her personal space into a research laboratory where she could pursue investigations that official channels would never authorize. Every surface was covered with evidence of her dedication to uncovering the truth, creating an environment that would have impressed academic researchers, but which would appear suspicious to anyone investigating her activities. The irony of her situation was not lost on Alice. Her unofficial investigation was producing insights that could revolutionize Allied communication security and save countless lives. But her isolation prevented her from sharing those discoveries with anyone who could act on them. She was simultaneously the base's greatest asset in combating enemy intelligence operations and its most suspected security threat, creating a paradox that seemed impossible to resolve through conventional channels. The exclusion from critical missions began subtly, with Alice being assigned to secondary communication duties while less experienced personnel handled primary operations. Major Crawford would announce patrol assignments and intelligence missions with careful deliberation, reading names from lists that somehow never included Lieutenant Davis despite her superior qualifications and technical expertise. The pattern became unmistakable. Every operation involving sensitive communications, every mission requiring advanced signal analysis, every assignment that could benefit from her unique skills was given to other personnel. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a competent but limited communications technician, found himself promoted to lead positions that Alice had previously handled with exceptional results. During briefings, Crawford would praise Rodriguez's reliable service and proven loyalty while discussing assignments that required exactly the type of advanced technical knowledge that Alice possessed in abundance. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Reliability meant conformity, and proven loyalty meant avoiding anyone whose brilliance might be perceived as threatening. The most frustrating aspect of this systematic exclusion was watching operations suffer due to inadequate communication support. Alice would sit in the communication center monitoring radio traffic from missions she should have been leading, listening to technical problems that she could have prevented, and security vulnerabilities that she had specifically warned about in reports that no one seemed to read. Her replacement operators struggled with encryption protocols that Alice could manage effortlessly, made routing decisions that compromised operational security, and failed to detect enemy signal intelligence activities that Alice's algorithms identified immediately. Lieutenant Walsh, who had once considered Alice a friend and mentor, now avoided eye contact during briefings where communication assignments were distributed. The transformation in their relationship reflected a broader pattern of social isolation that extended beyond professional exclusion. Colleagues who had previously sought Alice's technical advice now consulted less qualified personnel rather than risk association with someone under suspicion. Her expertise became a liability rather than an asset, creating situations where inferior technical solutions were preferred to superior ones that carried social stigma. Colonel Thorne's staff meetings evolved into exercises in coded communication where Alice's exclusion was discussed without mentioning her name. References to security concerns and personnel reliability issues became euphemisms for removing her from any operation that could provide additional evidence of either innocence or guilt. The investigation had created a limbo where Alice was too valuable to discharge but too suspicious to trust, resulting in assignments that utilized none of her capabilities while preventing her from demonstrating her loyalty. The reasoning behind her exclusion followed a logic that was simultaneously understandable and deeply flawed. Military operations require absolute trust between personnel, and any doubt about loyalty can compromise mission effectiveness and endanger lives. However, the criteria for determining trustworthiness had become circular. Alice was excluded from missions because she was under investigation, and the lack of opportunities to demonstrate loyalty was itself treated as evidence of guilt. Her isolation reinforced suspicion, which justified further isolation in an endless cycle of institutional paranoia. Intelligence operations particularly suffered from Alice's exclusion. Her replacement analysts lacked her ability to recognize sophisticated enemy signal manipulation techniques, leading to false conclusions about communication security and misdirected countermeasure efforts. Alice watched intelligence briefings where analysts presented findings that contradicted her research, recommending security measures that would actually increase vulnerability to the enemy techniques she had identified. Her knowledge could have prevented operational failures and saved lives, but sharing that knowledge would require acknowledging that her unofficial investigation had produced superior results to official channels. The emotional toll of watching her contributions become irrelevant was compounded by the knowledge that Allied personnel were dying due to preventable communication failures. Every casualty report that mentioned communication problems, every mission failure attributed to compromised operational security, every intelligence breakdown that could have been prevented through better technical analysis became a personal burden that Alice carried in isolation. She possessed solutions to problems that were costing lives, but her suspected disloyalty made those solutions politically unacceptable. Captain Mitchell's intelligence briefings began including subtle warnings about the dangers of relying on potentially compromised personnel for critical analysis. Without mentioning Alice specifically, Mitchell would discuss how enemy intelligence services might recruit individuals with technical expertise and security clearances, how loyalty could be compromised through emotional manipulation or ideological pressure, and how identifying internal threats required constant vigilance against personnel who seemed too interested in sensitive information. These presentations created an atmosphere where Alice's technical competence was reframed as potential evidence of espionage rather than dedication to mission success. The most painful dismissals came during emergent situations where Alice's skills were desperately needed, but her participation was deemed too risky. When communication systems failed during critical operations, when enemy jamming required sophisticated countermeasures, when complex technical problems threatened mission success, Alice would volunteer her assistance only to be politely but firmly excluded from problem-solving efforts. She was forced to watch inferior solutions fail while possessing knowledge that could have prevented disasters, creating a torture of professional helplessness that challenged her emotional stability. The transformation from colleague to suspect happened gradually, but Alice first noticed the change in the mess hall when conversations stopped as she approached tables where her fellow officers were eating. The silence would last just long enough to make her presence feel unwelcome before resuming with forced normalcy and topics carefully chosen to exclude her from participation. These moments of social isolation cut deeper than official exclusion from missions because they revealed how thoroughly suspicion had poisoned her relationships with people she had considered friends. Private conversations that Alice overheard painted an increasingly disturbing picture of how her dedication was being reinterpreted through the lens of paranoia. Her habit of working late hours in the communication center, once viewed as admirable commitment, was now discussed as evidence of unauthorized access to sensitive systems. Her comprehensive knowledge of Allied communication protocols, previously seen as professional excellence, was whispered about as suspicious familiarity with information that could be valuable to enemy intelligence services. Staff Sergeant Kim, whom Alice had trained in advanced encryption techniques just months earlier, was overheard telling other personnel that Alice's questions during technical briefings seemed designed to gather intelligence rather than solve problems. The accusation was particularly painful because Alice's questions had indeed been comprehensive and probing, but with the goal of understanding vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed, not information that could be exploited by hostile forces. Her thoroughness was being twisted into evidence of ulterior motives. The rumor mill began generating increasingly elaborate theories about Alice's potential disloyalty. Some personnel speculated that her Welsh background made her sympathetic to anti-NATO sentiment, despite Wales being a foundational member of the alliance. Others suggested that her emotional nature made her vulnerable to manipulation by sophisticated enemy agents who might exploit personal relationships to compromise her loyalty. The most hurtful rumors questioned whether her rapid promotion through technical merit programs was actually the result of foreign intelligence influence rather than genuine competence. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, one of the few senior officers who had previously shown Alice respect, began treating her with careful professional distance during their interactions. Their conversations became formal and limited to essential business, lacking the collegial warmth that had characterized their previous relationship. Hayes would acknowledge Alice's technical recommendations with non-committal responses that suggested political considerations outweighed professional judgment in determining whose advice to follow. Alice's emotional responses to the growing suspicion were themselves becoming evidence against her. When she became visibly upset during briefings where her loyalty was implicitly questioned, colleagues interpreted her reactions as guilt rather than natural hurt at being falsely accused. When she attempted to defend herself against rumors, her arguments were viewed as manipulation rather than legitimate efforts to clear her name. Her emotional intensity, once seen as passion for her work, was now characterized as instability that could make her susceptible to foreign influence. The investigation into communication security breaches took on an increasingly personal focus as investigators struggled to find technical evidence of system compromise. Rather than expanding their analysis to consider sophisticated enemy capabilities or external threats, investigators concentrated on personnel with access to sensitive information. Alice's comprehensive knowledge and emotional investment in communication security made her an attractive target for investigators seeking simple explanations for complex intelligence failures. Daily interactions became exercises in careful navigation as Alice tried to maintain professional relationships while avoiding any behavior that could be misinterpreted as suspicious. Her natural inclination to ask probing questions about technical problems was suppressed because curiosity was now viewed as potential intelligence gathering. Her efforts to contribute insights about enemy capabilities were scaled back because expertise was interpreted as suspicious knowledge. She found herself walking on eggshells in an environment where her greatest strengths had become her greatest liabilities. The psychological pressure of constant suspicion began affecting Alice's performance in subtle ways that further reinforced doubts about her reliability. The stress of being watched and judged made her second-guess decisions that she would previously have made with confidence. Her natural leadership abilities were constrained by awareness that taking initiative might be viewed as overstepping boundaries or attempting to access information beyond her authorized scope. The very act of being suspected was making her appear less competent, which seemed to justify the suspicion in a cruel feedback loop. Captain Rodriguez, who had once relied heavily on Alice's technical guidance, began openly questioning her recommendations during joint briefings. His challenges were framed as appropriate due diligence rather than personal attacks, but the cumulative effect was to undermine confidence in Alice's professional judgment. Other personnel began following Rodriguez's lead, treating Alice's expertise with skepticism that would never have been applied to equivalent recommendations from unsuspected colleagues. The most devastating aspect of this transformation was watching relationships that had taken months to build crumble under the weight of institutional paranoia. Alice realized that her emotional investment in her work and her colleagues had made her vulnerable to a type of pain that purely transactional relationships could never inflict. She had believed that competence and dedication would earn lasting respect, but learned that suspicion could override years of proven performance in a matter of weeks.
The meeting was scheduled for 800 hours on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and bright, with sunlight streaming through the windows of Colonel Thorne's office, as Alice reported for what she had been told would be a routine performance evaluation. The formal nature of the summons, delivered by an aide rather than through normal channels, had warned her that this encounter would be different from previous discussions. As she stood at attention before Thorne's desk, flanked by Major Crawford and Captain Mitchell, Alice understood that her military career hung in the balance. "Lieutenant Davis," Colonel Thorne began, his weathered face grave with the weight of command decisions that could destroy careers and lives, "we need to address some serious concerns that have been raised about your conduct and your access to sensitive information." The words carried the finality of institutional judgment, delivered with the clinical precision of someone who had ended military careers before and would do so again without hesitation. Alice felt her heart rate increase as she recognized that this was not a discussion, but a verdict being delivered. Major Crawford leaned forward in his chair, consulting a thick file that contained months of observations, reports, and analysis that had built the case against her. Each accusation was delivered with the bureaucratic language that transformed dedication into suspicion, thoroughness into overreach, and competence into potential treachery. The irony was overwhelming. Alice was being criticized for exactly the qualities that had made her exceptional at her job: curiosity about technical systems, comprehensive analysis of communication security, and proactive investigation of potential vulnerabilities. The very traits that had earned her rapid promotion and recognition were now being presented as evidence of disloyalty and potential espionage. Her excellence had become her burden, and her dedication had been twisted into proof of guilt. Captain Mitchell opened a second file containing printouts of communication logs, system access records, and analysis reports that documented Alice's unofficial investigation into security breaches. "Can you explain why you've been conducting unauthorized analysis of classified communication patterns during off-duty hours?" The question was phrased as though research and problem-solving were inherently suspicious activities rather than the natural behavior of someone committed to mission success and Allied security. Alice's response was measured but passionate, reflecting months of frustration at being unable to share her discoveries through official channels. "Sir, I identified anomalies in our communication security that suggested sophisticated enemy signal intelligence capabilities. I conducted additional analysis to better understand the threat and develop potential countermeasures." Her explanation was technically accurate and professionally justified, but she could see in their expressions that her thoroughness was being interpreted as confirmation of their suspicions rather than evidence of her loyalty. Colonel Thorne's voice carried the weight of institutional authority as he delivered the judgment that had been predetermined before the meeting began. "Lieutenant Davis, your unauthorized activities represent a serious breach of protocol and raise significant questions about your reliability and judgment. Effective immediately, you are being removed from all duties involving classified information and placed under administrative review pending completion of a formal investigation." The words hit Alice like physical blows, each syllable representing the destruction of everything she had worked to achieve. Her security clearance, her access to communication systems, her ability to contribute to Allied operations, everything that gave her professional life meaning was being stripped away based on suspicion rather than evidence. She was being punished for being too good at her job, too dedicated to her mission, and too determined to protect the lives of her fellow soldiers. Major Crawford's follow-up instructions were delivered with bureaucratic efficiency that emphasized how thoroughly her isolation would be enforced. "You will be assigned to administrative duties under direct supervision. All access to communication systems is revoked. You are prohibited from entering secure areas without escort. Any violation of these restrictions will result in immediate disciplinary action and potential criminal charges." The comprehensive nature of her restrictions revealed how completely the command structure had accepted her guilt. Alice's attempt to defend herself was met with polite but firm dismissal that characterized her explanations as irrelevant to the decision that had already been made. "Sir, my research identified enemy capabilities that could compromise Allied operations. I can provide evidence that our communication security has been breached through sophisticated external methods rather than internal leaks." Her words carried the desperation of someone watching a preventable disaster unfold while being powerless to stop it. The response from Colonel Thorne revealed the circular logic that had trapped Alice in an impossible situation. "Your unauthorized access to sensitive information and your comprehensive knowledge of communication vulnerabilities are themselves evidence of the security concerns we're addressing. Your explanations only confirm the need for the restrictions we're implementing." Her competence was being used as proof of her guilt, creating a paradox where innocence became impossible to demonstrate. As the meeting concluded, Alice understood that she was facing a choice between accepting institutional judgment or risking everything to prove her loyalty through actions rather than words. The system had failed to recognize her dedication, had twisted her strengths into weaknesses, and had chosen scapegoating over honest analysis of security failures. Standing in that sunlit office, listening to her career being systematically dismantled, Alice made a decision that would define the rest of her life. The final words of the meeting echoed in Alice's mind as she was escorted from the colonel's office under the eyes of personnel who had once respected her expertise and leadership. She had been transformed from a valued member of the team into a suspected enemy, from a problem solver into a problem that needed to be contained. But Alice Davis had never been someone who accepted limitations imposed by others, and she wasn't about to start now.
The emergency klaxon shattered the routine quiet of Forward Operating Base Blackwood at 1:34 hours on what had started as an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. Alice was in the administrative office, filing routine paperwork under the watchful eye of Sergeant Phillips, when the urgent alarm sent personnel scrambling toward their emergency stations. Through the office window, she could see soldiers running across the compound with the purposeful urgency that indicated a genuine crisis rather than a training exercise. Within minutes, the base communication system crackled with fragmentary reports that painted an increasingly dire picture. 3 Allied patrol units, comprising nearly 500 personnel, had been conducting a coordinated sweep operation in the mountainous region 30 kilometers northeast of Blackwood when they walked into what appeared to be a sophisticated enemy ambush. The initial reports were confused and contradictory, but one thing was clear. Allied forces were trapped in a kill zone, with enemy forces occupying commanding positions on the surrounding ridgelines. Alice listened to the radio traffic with growing horror as the situation became clear. The enemy had demonstrated uncanny knowledge of Allied patrol routes, timing, and communication frequencies. They had positioned forces to cut off retreat routes, established overlapping fields of fire that made movement impossible, and were using sophisticated jamming equipment to disrupt Allied communications. The 3 units, Alpha Company, Bravo Company, and Charlie Company, were effectively isolated from command and from each other, facing annihilation in terrain that offered little natural cover. Colonel Thorne's voice echoed through the base communication system as he attempted to coordinate a rescue operation from the command center. All available units, prepare for immediate deployment. We have 3 companies under heavy fire and unable to maneuver. Air support is en route but hampered by weather conditions in the target area. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable, but Alice could hear the underlying frustration of a commander whose options were limited by the tactical advantages that enemy forces had achieved. The geographic challenges facing any rescue operation were formidable. The ambush site was located in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridgelines that provided excellent defensive positions for enemy forces, while limiting Allied approaches to predictable routes that could be easily covered by enemy fire. Weather conditions in the mountains were deteriorating rapidly, with low clouds limiting visibility and making air support increasingly dangerous. Time was critical, but conventional rescue approaches would likely result in additional casualties without successfully extracting the trapped personnel. Alice's administrative supervisor, Sergeant Phillips, was monitoring multiple radio frequencies to track the developing crisis, and his expression grew increasingly grim as reports continued to arrive. "Enemy forces are using our own communication protocols," he muttered, adjusting the frequency settings on his radio equipment. "They're coordinating their attacks using Allied encryption standards and jamming our frequencies with precision that suggests intimate knowledge of our communication systems." The technical sophistication of the enemy operation confirmed Alice's worst fears about the intelligence capabilities she had been investigating. This was not a random ambush or opportunistic attack, but a carefully planned operation that exploited detailed knowledge of Allied procedures, equipment, and communication security. The enemy forces were demonstrating capabilities that official intelligence assessments had consistently underestimated, using exactly the type of advanced signal intelligence techniques that Alice had identified in her unauthorized research. Major Crawford's voice joined the radio coordination efforts as he attempted to organize ground-based rescue operations. Rescue Convoy Alpha proceed to Checkpoint 7 and establish overwatch positions. Rescue Convoy Bravo advance to Checkpoint 9 and prepare for diversionary assault on enemy eastern positions. His orders reflected conventional military thinking about rescue operations, but Alice realized that standard approaches would be ineffective against an enemy that could anticipate Allied movements through sophisticated intelligence capabilities. The trapped companies were reporting increasing casualties as enemy forces maintained accurate fire on any attempt at movement or consolidation. Medical evacuation was impossible due to enemy control of potential landing zones, and ammunition supplies were running low after hours of sustained combat. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional rescue approaches were proving inadequate against an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural awareness of Allied intentions and capabilities. Alice found herself in the unique position of understanding both the tactical situation and the underlying intelligence factors that made conventional rescue operations doomed to failure. Her months of research into enemy signal intelligence capabilities had revealed exactly the type of coordination that was now being used to devastating effect against Allied forces. She possessed knowledge that could potentially save 500 lives, but her suspected disloyalty made that knowledge politically unacceptable to the command structure that desperately needed it. The irony was devastating. The very investigation that had led to accusations of treason had produced insights that could prevent the massacre of Allied personnel. Alice's unauthorized research had identified enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities that official intelligence channels had missed, creating a situation where the suspect traitor possessed the key to saving the lives of those who doubted her. As Alice listened to the increasingly desperate radio communications from the trapped companies, a pattern emerged that confirmed her worst fears about enemy capabilities, while simultaneously revealing a potential solution that no one else would recognize. The enemy forces were not just using sophisticated jamming equipment and intercepted communication protocols. They were manipulating Allied radio traffic in real time to create false impressions about friendly force locations and intentions. This level of signal intelligence sophistication required equipment and expertise that Allied commanders didn't even know existed. The key insight came when Alice recognized discrepancies in the timing and routing of communication signals that indicated enemy forces were using a technique called signal reflection amplification, a cutting-edge electronic warfare method that she had identified in academic research, but which official military intelligence had dismissed as theoretically possible but practically unfeasible. Enemy forces were using the mountainous terrain and strategically positioned equipment to capture, analyze, and retransmit Allied communications with subtle modifications that created confusion and misdirection. This level of signal intelligence sophistication required equipment and expertise that Allied commanders didn't even know existed. The key insight came when Alice recognized discrepancies in the timing and routing of communication signals that indicated enemy forces were using a technique called signal reflection amplification, a cutting-edge electronic warfare method that she had identified in academic research, but which official military intelligence had dismissed as theoretically possible.
Enemy forces were using the mountainous terrain and strategically positioned equipment to capture, analyze, and retransmit Allied communications with subtle modifications that created confusion and misdirection. Alice's months of unauthorized research had not only identified this capability, but had also revealed its primary vulnerability. Signal reflection amplification required centralized coordination through a master control station that processed all intercepted communications before retransmitting them. If that control station could be located and neutralized, the entire enemy communication advantage would collapse, leaving their forces isolated and vulnerable to the type of coordinated assault that Allied forces excelled at executing. The location of the enemy control station was not immediately obvious, but Alice's comprehensive analysis of regional geography and signal propagation patterns had identified 3 possible sites where such equipment could be effectively positioned. More importantly, her research had revealed that the control station would need to maintain constant communication with multiple subordinate units, creating a unique electromagnetic signature that could be detected and tracked using specialized analysis techniques that she had developed during her investigation. The problem was that Alice no longer had access to the sophisticated monitoring equipment necessary to locate the enemy control station, and her suspected disloyalty meant that sharing her insights through official channels would likely result in dismissal rather than action. She possessed the knowledge to save 500 Allied personnel, but the institutional paranoia that had branded her as a potential traitor prevented her from communicating that knowledge to anyone who could act on it. The emotional weight of the situation was crushing. Alice could hear the voices of soldiers she knew personally, calling for medical evacuation, reporting wounded personnel, and requesting ammunition resupply that would never arrive through conventional means. Lieutenant Martinez from Alpha Company, whom she had helped train on communication protocols just months earlier, was coordinating defensive positions with the calm professionalism of someone who understood that survival required perfect execution under impossible circumstances. Captain Thompson from Charlie Company was attempting to establish communication with Base Command using techniques that Alice had taught him, but his efforts were being systematically countered by enemy forces who seemed to anticipate every attempted coordination. The sound of his increasingly frustrated transmissions revealed a man watching his soldiers die while being unable to effectively request support or coordinate with adjacent units. Alice realized that she faced a choice that would define not only her own future, but potentially determine whether 500 Allied personnel would survive the day. She could follow the restrictions that had been placed on her, maintaining the institutional order that had branded her as a security risk while watching fellow soldiers die from preventable causes. Or she could violate those restrictions one final time, using her knowledge and skills to attempt a rescue operation that official channels would never authorize. The decision crystallized as Alice listened to Bravo Company's radio operator reporting that their position was being overrun and requesting immediate extraction. She recognized the voice as belonging to Corporal Williams, a young soldier from Yorkshire who reminded her of her younger brother back in Wales. The desperation in his transmission made it clear that conventional rescue operations would arrive too late to save him and the soldiers depending on his communication coordination. Standing in that administrative office, surrounded by filing cabinets and routine paperwork, while 500 soldiers fight for their lives 30 kilometers away, Alice understood that some choices transcend military hierarchy and institutional procedures. Her loyalty had never been to the officers who suspected her or the bureaucracy that had marginalized her. It had always been to the soldiers whose lives depended on communication systems working properly and intelligence being accurate and actionable. The technical challenge of what she was contemplating was immense. Locating and neutralizing the enemy control station would require accessing classified communication equipment, conducting unauthorized signal analysis, and coordinating with combat operations through channels that had been explicitly forbidden to her. Success would require not only technical expertise, but also courage to act on analysis that others had dismissed and determination to save lives regardless of personal consequences. Alice looked out the window at the mountains where her fellow soldiers were dying and made the decision that would transform her from suspected traitor to unlikely hero. She would prove her loyalty not through words or bureaucratic compliance, but through actions that demonstrated her absolute commitment to Allied personnel and mission success. The system had failed to recognize her dedication, but history would record what happened when institutional paranoia met individual courage in the mountains of Eastern Europe.
The tone to act required careful calculation and perfect timing. She waited until Sergeant Phillips became absorbed in coordinating supply logistics for the rescue operation before quietly approaching the radio equipment that could provide the signal analysis capabilities she needed. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency across control interfaces that she knew better than anyone else on the base, initiating scans that would reveal the electromagnetic signature of the enemy control station if her theoretical analysis proved correct. The data that appeared on her screen confirmed Alice's worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. Enemy forces were indeed using signal reflection amplification coordinated through a centralized control station, and that station was located at precisely the geographic position that her unauthorized research had identified as most likely. The electromagnetic signature was unmistakable, revealing sophisticated equipment that was actively processing and retransmitting Allied communications in real time to create tactical confusion and misdirection. Alice quickly printed the analysis results and headed directly to the command center, knowing that she was violating explicit orders but understanding that 500 lives hung in the balance. The command center buzzed with desperate activity as officers attempted to coordinate rescue operations using incomplete information and conventional tactics that were proving inadequate against the enemy's sophisticated capabilities. Colonel Thorne stood at the center of the chaos, his weathered face reflecting the strain of command decisions that could result in massive casualties. "Colonel Thorne," Alice said, approaching with the printouts that contained her analysis, "I've identified the source of enemy communication advantages and located their control station. If we can neutralize this position, their entire coordination system will collapse and our trapped personnel can be extracted successfully." Her voice carried the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out, but also the confidence of technical expertise that had never been wrong about communication systems. The command center fell silent as every officer turned to stare at the suspected traitor who had just interrupted their crisis coordination to offer intelligence analysis. Major Crawford was the first to respond, his voice sharp with authority and institutional loyalty. "Lieutenant Davis, you are not authorized to be in this facility, and you have no business offering tactical recommendations. Security, escort Lieutenant Davis back to administrative duties immediately." Colonel Thorne raised his hand to delay Crawford's order, his command experience recognizing that desperate situations sometimes require listening to unconventional sources. "What exactly are you claiming to have discovered, Davis?" His tone was skeptical but not dismissive, reflecting a willingness to consider any information that might save the lives of soldiers under his command, regardless of its source. Alice spread her analysis across the command table, pointing to the electromagnetic signature data that revealed the enemy control station's location and function. Enemy forces are using signal reflection amplification to intercept, analyze, and retransmit our communications with modifications that create tactical confusion.
This technique requires centralized coordination through a master control station here. She indicated a position on the tactical map. On Ridge 7 Alpha, approximately 12 kilometers northeast of the ambush site. Captain Mitchell examined the analysis with professional skepticism, her intelligence training making her naturally suspicious of information from unauthorized sources. Even if your analysis is correct, Davis, neutralizing a heavily defended enemy position would require resources we don't have and time we can't spare. Our priority must be direct extraction of trapped personnel using available assets. Alice's response revealed the depth of her tactical understanding and her absolute commitment to saving Allied lives. Ma'am, direct extraction attempts will fail because enemy forces can monitor our communications and anticipate our movements. They've been using our own tactical coordination against us. But if we neutralize their control station first, they'll lose their intelligence advantage and become vulnerable to the type of coordinated assault that our forces excel at executing. The silence that followed Alice's explanation stretched uncomfortably as command personnel processed the implications of accepting intelligence analysis from someone under investigation for potential treason. Major Crawford finally broke the silence with institutional loyalty that prioritized procedure over results. Colonel, we cannot base tactical decisions on unauthorized analysis from personnel whose reliability is under investigation. The security implications alone make this recommendation unacceptable. Colonel Thorne's response reflected the impossible position that institutional paranoia had created. Davis, your analysis may be technically sound, but your current status makes it impossible to act on intelligence you've gathered through unauthorized methods. We cannot risk additional personnel on operations based on information from sources that our own investigation has deemed compromised. Alice felt the familiar frustration of watching preventable disasters unfold while being powerless to stop them. But this time, the stakes involved hundreds of lives rather than abstract security concerns. Sir, I understand the institutional concerns, but our soldiers are dying while we debate the political acceptability of information that you're choosing to ignore because of who provided it. My loyalty has never been to bureaucratic procedures. It's been to the personnel whose lives depend on communication systems working properly. The rejection was delivered with the finality of institutional decision-making that prioritized protecting organizational interests over individual lives. Lieutenant Davis, you are to return to administrative duties immediately. Any further unauthorized activities will result in immediate detention and formal charges. This discussion is concluded. Colonel Thorne's words carried the weight of command authority, but Alice could see the doubt in his eyes as he chose institutional loyalty over tactical innovation. As security personnel moved to escort Alice from the command center, she made one final attempt to penetrate the bureaucratic resistance that was condemning 500 soldiers to preventable casualties. Colonel, in 6 hours, you'll be writing casualty reports that could have been prevented with information that you're choosing to ignore because of who provided it. My fellow soldiers deserve better than institutional paranoia disguised as security protocol. The escort from the command center felt like a death march, as Alice was led past officers who might have saved hundreds of lives if they had possessed the courage to act on accurate intelligence regardless of its source. She had offered them the key to tactical victory, and they had chosen bureaucratic safety over operational success. But Alice Davis had never accepted institutional limitations when lives were at stake, and she wasn't about to start now.
The tone returned to the administrative office with her mind already racing through the calculations necessary for the unauthorized operation she was about to undertake.
Sergeant Phillips was still occupied with supply coordination, providing her with the opportunity to assess her limited resources and develop a plan that could neutralize the enemy control station despite her restricted access to equipment and personnel. The mathematics of the situation were daunting, but Alice had never been deterred by impossible odds when the alternative was watching fellow soldiers die. The enemy control station represented both the source of Allied tactical disadvantage and the key to turning the battle in favor of the trapped companies. Alice's analysis had revealed not only its location, but also its vulnerabilities. The sophisticated equipment required constant power from portable generators, needed clear line-of-sight communication with multiple subordinate positions, and would be defended by personnel whose primary expertise was electronic warfare rather than conventional combat operations. Alice's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its personal cost. She would need to access the base's communication equipment to coordinate with the trapped companies, provide them with intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities, and guide them through a coordinated assault on the control station that would eliminate their tactical disadvantage. The operation would require her to violate every restriction that had been placed on her while simultaneously conducting complex technical analysis and tactical coordination under combat conditions. The first step required access to sophisticated communication equipment that had been explicitly forbidden to her. Alice waited until Sergeant Phillips left the administrative office to attend a briefing, then quietly moved to the advanced radio system that connected Blackwood with forward operating positions. Her fingers moved across familiar controls with the muscle memory of thousands of hours of training and operational experience, establishing encrypted connections with the trapped companies using techniques that bypassed enemy monitoring capabilities. Alpha 6, this is Blackwood Actual, Alice transmitted using Colonel Thorne's call sign but her own voice, gambling that desperate soldiers would prioritize receiving critical intelligence over questioning communication protocols. The response from Alpha Company came immediately, carrying the desperate relief of soldiers who had given up hope of receiving meaningful support. Blackwood Actual, this is Alpha 6, we are prepared to receive any intelligence that can help us extract our personnel. Enemy forces seem to anticipate our every movement, and conventional tactics are proving ineffective. Alice began transmitting the detailed tactical analysis that her unauthorized research had produced, providing Alpha Company with information about enemy signal intelligence capabilities, control station location, and coordination vulnerabilities that could be exploited through careful timing and misdirection. Her instructions were precise and comprehensive, reflecting months of technical analysis condensed into actionable intelligence that could save lives if executed properly. The communication with Bravo and Charlie companies followed similar patterns, with Alice providing each unit with specific information about enemy capabilities while coordinating their movements to create a synchronized assault on the control station. Her tactical coordination went far beyond her official duties, but Alice understood that saving 500 Allied personnel required expertise that no one else possessed and courage that institutional procedures would never authorize. As Alice conducted her unauthorized coordination operation, she was acutely aware that every transmission was being recorded and that her actions would provide irrefutable evidence of insubordination that would end her military career and likely result in criminal charges. But the alternative, watching 500 soldiers die because institutional paranoia prevented effective action, was unacceptable to someone whose loyalty had always been to fellow personnel rather than bureaucratic procedures. The technical complexity of coordinating 3 separate companies through sophisticated enemy countermeasures while maintaining communication security required Alice to utilize every skill she had developed during her years of military service. She was simultaneously analyzing enemy signal patterns, coordinating tactical movements, and providing real-time intelligence updates while operating equipment that she was prohibited from accessing through methods that violated explicit orders. The emotional weight of her decision was overwhelming. Alice understood that she was crossing a line that would transform her from suspected traitor to confirmed insubordinate, providing her critics with exactly the evidence they needed to justify their previous suspicions. But she also understood that 500 soldiers were depending on her expertise to survive a situation that conventional military procedures could not resolve. Alice's final transmission to the trapped companies carried both tactical instructions and personal commitment that revealed the depth of her dedication to Allied personnel. All stations, execute coordinated assault on enemy control station in 30 minutes, maintain communication discipline and coordinate timing precisely. Remember that your fellow soldiers are counting on you to execute this operation perfectly. Blackwood Actual, out. As Alice concluded her unauthorized coordination operation and prepared for the inevitable consequences of her actions, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been branded as a potential traitor for conducting the research that was now saving lives, excluded from operations that desperately needed her expertise, and forbidden from using the skills that made her uniquely qualified to resolve the crisis. But none of that mattered compared to the knowledge that she had given 500 Allied soldiers the chance to survive against impossible odds. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside the administrative office warned Alice that her unauthorized activities had been detected and that the reckoning for her actions was about to begin. But she faced that prospect with the calm confidence of someone who had chosen loyalty to fellow soldiers over institutional compliance, knowing that history would judge her actions by their results rather than their conformity to bureaucratic procedures.
The door to the administrative office burst open as Major Crawford entered with 2 military police officers, their expressions reflecting the institutional outrage of discovering that the suspected traitor had violated every restriction placed on her activities. Alice remained seated at the communication console, her hands still positioned over controls that she had been explicitly forbidden to operate, displaying the calm defiance of someone who had accepted the consequences of necessary actions before undertaking them. Lieutenant Davis. Crawford's voice carried the fury of authority that had been deliberately circumvented. You are under arrest for violation of direct orders, unauthorized access to classified communication systems, and potential espionage activities. His words echoed through the office with bureaucratic finality, but Alice noticed that he made no move to immediately disconnect the communication equipment that was still coordinating the tactical operation she had initiated. The timing of Alice's arrest created an impossible situation for base command. She had successfully established coordination with the 3 trapped companies and provided them with tactical intelligence that was already being implemented in combat operations. Disconnecting her unauthorized communications would leave 500 Allied personnel without the coordination they needed to execute the complex assault on the enemy control station. But allowing her to continue would represent institutional acceptance of insubordination and potential treason. Colonel Thorne arrived at the administrative office within minutes, his weathered face reflecting the command burden of making decisions that would determine both Alice's fate and the survival of the trapped companies. Davis? His voice carried grudging recognition of tactical realities that transcended bureaucratic procedures. Your unauthorized operation is already underway. Can it succeed without continued coordination from this position? Alice's response revealed both her technical expertise and her absolute commitment to the soldiers whose lives depended on her unauthorized actions. Sir, the companies need continuous coordination for the next 45 minutes to execute the synchronized assault successfully. If communication is terminated now, they will likely fail to neutralize the enemy control station, and casualties will be severe. The command decision that followed would define Colonel Thorne's career and potentially save or doom 500 Allied personnel. Colonel Thorne arrived at the administrative office within minutes, his weathered face reflecting the command burden of making decisions that would determine both Alice's fate and the survival of the trapped companies. Davis, his voice carried grudging recognition of tactical realities that transcended bureaucratic procedures. Your unauthorized operation is already underway. Can it succeed without continued coordination from this position? Alice's response revealed both her technical expertise and her absolute commitment to the soldiers whose lives depended on her unauthorized actions. Sir, the companies need continuous coordination for the next 45 minutes to execute the synchronized assault successfully. If communication is terminated now, they will likely fail to neutralize the enemy control station, and casualties will be severe. The command decision that followed would define Colonel Thorne's career and potentially save or doom 500 Allied personnel. After consulting briefly with Major Crawford and reviewing tactical displays that showed the trapped companies moving into assault positions, Thorne made the choice that prioritized results over procedures. Continue coordination until the operation is complete. Military police will maintain custody, but operational necessity requires completion of unauthorized tactical coordination. Alice returned to her communication equipment under armed guard, conducting the most important operation of her military career while facing charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. Her voice remained calm and professional as she guided Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie companies through the complex tactical maneuvers necessary to approach the enemy control station without being detected by the sophisticated monitoring equipment she had identified. The assault coordination required Alice to simultaneously track the movements of 3 separate companies, monitor enemy communication patterns for signs that their approach had been detected, and provide real-time tactical adjustments based on changing battlefield conditions. Her months of unauthorized research enabled her to recognize subtle changes in enemy signal patterns that indicated when their forces were repositioning or when their surveillance capabilities were being redirected. Alpha 6, adjust approach angle 15 degrees north to avoid enemy observation post at grid reference 347521. Alice transmitted with the precise confidence of someone whose intelligence analysis had never been wrong about technical systems. Bravo 6, halt advance for 3 minutes to allow Alpha element to reach coordinated assault position. Charlie 6, prepare to execute diversionary action on my mark. The technical sophistication of Alice's coordination went far beyond conventional military communication protocols. She was using advanced signal analysis techniques to ensure that Allied transmissions remained undetected, while simultaneously monitoring enemy communications for tactical intelligence that could improve assault effectiveness. Her unauthorized research had provided her with capabilities that no other personnel possessed, making her indispensable despite her suspected disloyalty. As the trapped companies moved into final assault positions, Alice could hear the strain in their voices that reflected hours of combat under impossible conditions. Lieutenant Martinez from Alpha Company reported casualties and ammunition shortages that emphasized how desperate their situation had become. Captain Thompson from Charlie Company transmitted position updates with the calm professionalism of someone who understood that survival required perfect execution under extreme pressure. The final coordination phase required Alice to time the simultaneous assault by 3 separate companies with precision that would determine success or failure of the entire operation. Her calculations had to account for terrain variations, communication delays, and the sophisticated enemy countermeasures that had made conventional rescue operations impossible. One mistake in timing or coordination would result in massive Allied casualties and the continuation of enemy tactical advantages. All stations, this is Blackwood Actual. Execute assault on enemy control station in 60 seconds. Maintain communication discipline and coordinate fire support precisely. Remember that eliminating this target will save not only your lives, but potentially prevent future casualties from similar enemy operations. As Alice concluded her coordination instructions and prepared to monitor the assault that would determine the fate of 500 Allied personnel, she was acutely aware that she had crossed every institutional boundary that defines acceptable military behavior. But she was also aware that her unauthorized actions represented the only chance for Allied victory against an enemy whose sophistication had been consistently underestimated by official intelligence channels.
The coordinated assault on the enemy control station began at exactly 15:45 hours with a precision that reflected Alice's meticulous planning and the desperate determination of soldiers fighting for their survival. Through her communication equipment, Alice monitored the tactical situation as Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie companies executed the complex maneuvers she had coordinated, their movements guided by intelligence that her unauthorized research had produced and tactical coordination that violated every regulation governing her activities. The enemy control station was positioned on Ridge 7 Alpha in a location that provided excellent surveillance capabilities while being protected by natural terrain features and sophisticated defensive arrangements. Alice's analysis had revealed that the position was defended by approximately 30 enemy personnel, whose primary expertise was electronic warfare rather than conventional combat, creating a vulnerability that could be exploited by properly coordinated Allied forces with superior tactical training. Blackwood Actual, this is Alpha 6, Lieutenant Martinez transmitted as his company approached the target area. Enemy position is heavily fortified, but defensive arrangements appear designed to counter conventional approaches rather than the coordinated assault pattern you've recommended. His transmission confirmed Alice's analysis about enemy priorities and validated her tactical recommendations about approach angles and assault timing. Alice monitored multiple communication frequencies simultaneously, tracking the progress of each company while analyzing enemy signal patterns for indications that their assault had been detected prematurely. Her sophisticated understanding of electronic warfare capabilities enabled her to recognize when enemy forces were attempting to coordinate defensive responses and when their communication systems were being disrupted by the approaching Allied assault. The technical complexity of coordinating 3 separate companies through enemy countermeasures while maintaining operational security required Alice to utilize skills that extended far beyond conventional military communication protocols. She was simultaneously conducting signal intelligence analysis, tactical coordination, and real-time battlefield assessment using techniques that she had developed during months of unauthorized research into enemy capabilities. Bravo 6, enemy surveillance equipment at grid reference 348523 is attempting to track your approach, Alice transmitted, with the precision of technical analysis combined with tactical urgency. Adjust movement pattern to exploit dead space in their coverage area. Charlie 6, prepare to execute diversionary assault in 30 seconds to draw enemy attention from primary approach routes. The assault itself unfolded with mechanical precision as the 3 companies executed Alice's coordination instructions with the professional competence of Allied forces operating under optimal tactical conditions. Alpha Company approached the control station from the northeast using terrain features that Alice's analysis had identified as blind spots in enemy surveillance coverage. Bravo Company established overwatch positions that provided supporting fire while remaining concealed from enemy detection systems. Charlie Company's diversionary assault drew enemy attention and defensive fire away from the primary approach routes, creating the tactical confusion necessary for Alpha and Bravo Companies to reach assault positions without being detected by the sophisticated monitoring equipment that had previously given enemy forces overwhelming advantages. The coordination was flawless, reflecting months of Alice's technical preparation combined with the tactical expertise of Allied personnel executing under optimal conditions. The destruction of the enemy control station occurred at 16:12 hours with devastating effectiveness that immediately transformed the tactical situation throughout the battlefield. Alice monitored enemy communication frequencies as their sophisticated coordination capabilities collapsed, leaving individual enemy units isolated and unable to maintain the tactical advantages that had made them so effective against conventional Allied approaches. "All stations, this is Alpha 6, Martinez transmitted, with the relief of tactical victory combined with professional pride in mission accomplishment. Enemy control station is destroyed. Repeat, target is neutralized. Enemy forces are losing coordination and withdrawing from prepared positions. Request immediate extraction support for all companies." The transformation in battlefield dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Enemy forces that had possessed supernatural awareness of Allied movements suddenly became vulnerable to the type of coordinated operations that Allied training emphasized. Their tactical advantages evaporated as communication systems failed and coordination collapsed, leaving them exposed to Allied forces who could now maneuver freely without fear of anticipated enemy responses. Alice coordinated the extraction of all three companies with the same precision that had characterized the assault operation, guiding Allied helicopter support to secure landing zones that enemy forces could no longer effectively contest. Her technical expertise enabled her to ensure that extraction operations proceeded safely while monitoring enemy communication attempts for signs of tactical reorganization or renewed threats. The final tally revealed the magnitude of Alice's achievement: 500 Allied personnel successfully extracted with minimal additional casualties, enemy tactical advantages permanently eliminated, and a sophisticated enemy operation completely neutralized through unauthorized actions that official channels would never have approved. Her technical expertise and tactical coordination had achieved what conventional military approaches could not accomplish. As the last extraction helicopter departed the battlefield, Alice realized that she had proven her loyalty through actions rather than words, demonstrated her value through results rather than compliance, and saved hundreds of lives through expertise that institutional paranoia had attempted to suppress. But she also understood that her unauthorized actions would require a reckoning that could transform her from hero to criminal, depending on how institutional priorities valued results versus procedures. The aftermath of Alice's unauthorized rescue operation created an institutional crisis that forced Forward Operating Base Blackwood to confront the fundamental contradiction between bureaucratic procedures and tactical effectiveness. Colonel Thorne stood in his office 3 hours after the successful extraction, reviewing after-action reports that documented how a suspected traitor had accomplished what official military operations could not achieve, saving 500 Allied personnel through expertise that regulations had attempted to suppress. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Alice's technical analysis had correctly identified enemy capabilities that official intelligence channels had missed. Her tactical coordination had enabled Allied forces to achieve decisive victory against sophisticated opposition. And her unauthorized actions had prevented what would have been the largest Allied casualty incident in the theater's operational history. But her methods had violated every regulation governing military discipline and communication security. Major Crawford found himself in the impossible position of recommending disciplinary action against someone whose insubordination had saved hundreds of lives and whose technical expertise had proven superior to official intelligence analysis. His report documented numerous violations of direct orders, unauthorized access to classified systems, and deliberate circumvention of command authority, but also acknowledged that conventional procedures would have resulted in massive casualties that Alice's actions had prevented. The investigation that followed revealed the devastating extent to which institutional paranoia had compromised Allied operational effectiveness. Alice's unauthorized research had identified enemy capabilities months before official channels recognized the threat. Her technical recommendations had been dismissed despite their obvious merit, and her expertise had been suppressed precisely when it was most needed to counter sophisticated enemy operations. Captain Mitchell's intelligence assessment concluded that Alice's analysis of enemy signal intelligence capabilities was not only accurate but represented the most comprehensive understanding of the threat that existed within Allied forces. Her months of unauthorized research had produced insights that could revolutionize communication security and prevent future casualties. But those insights had been ignored because of suspicions about her loyalty that proved to be completely unfounded. The transformation in Alice's status occurred gradually as the implications of her success became clear to base personnel who had previously viewed her as a security threat. The same colleagues who had avoided her in the mess hall now sought her expertise for technical problems. The officers who had questioned her loyalty now deferred to her judgment on communication security issues. And the institutional procedures that had marginalized her were quietly modified to accommodate her unique capabilities. Colonel Thorne's decision regarding Alice's fate reflected a command judgment that prioritized operational effectiveness over bureaucratic consistency. Rather than pursuing disciplinary action against someone whose unauthorized actions had saved 500 lives, he recommended Alice for immediate promotion and transfer to a specialized intelligence position where her technical expertise could be properly utilized without institutional interference. The broader impact of Alice's rescue operation extended far beyond Forward Operating Base Blackwood as her technical innovations and tactical insights were integrated into Allied communication protocols throughout the theater. Her analysis of enemy signal intelligence capabilities led to comprehensive security improvements that prevented similar attacks on Allied forces. And her coordination techniques became standard procedures for complex extraction operations in hostile environments. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had maintained careful distance during Alice's period of suspicion, now acknowledged that institutional paranoia had nearly cost Allied forces their most valuable technical asset. Her private conversation with Alice revealed the extent to which fear of internal threats had compromised the military's ability to utilize exceptional talent and innovative thinking when they were most desperately needed. The personal vindication that Alice experienced was profound, but complicated by the knowledge that institutional resistance to unconventional thinking remained embedded in military culture despite the dramatic success of her unauthorized actions. Her transformation from suspected traitor to celebrated hero revealed how easily competence could be mistaken for threat, and how institutional procedures could obstruct rather than facilitate mission accomplishment. Alice's new role as senior intelligence analyst provided her with the authority and resources necessary to pursue the type of comprehensive technical research that had enabled her rescue operation, but within official channels that recognized rather than suppress her contributions. Her first assignment involved developing countermeasures to prevent enemy forces from replicating the signal intelligence capabilities that had made their ambush so effective. The letters that Alice received from personnel in Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie companies provided personal testimony to the impact of her unauthorized actions. Lieutenant Martinez wrote about returning home to his family in Texas because someone had possessed the courage to act when institutional procedures failed. Captain Thompson expressed gratitude for leadership that prioritized lives over regulations when the two came into conflict. 6 months after the rescue operation, Alice stood in the same briefing room where she had once been excluded from critical missions and dismissed as a security threat. But everything had changed. Her analysis was now sought and respected, her recommendations were implemented without question, and her expertise was recognized as essential to Allied operational success in the complex electronic warfare environment of modern conflict. The institutional transformation that followed Alice's success created new procedures for identifying and utilizing exceptional talent while maintaining necessary security protocols. Her case became a textbook example of how fear of internal threats could compromise operational effectiveness, and how individual courage could overcome institutional failure when lives were at stake. As Alice concluded her latest briefing on enemy communication capabilities, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from suspected traitor to essential asset. She had proven that loyalty was measured by actions rather than compliance, that expertise deserved recognition regardless of its source, and that saving lives sometimes required the courage to violate regulations that prioritized procedures over people. The afternoon sun streamed through the briefing room windows as Alice prepared for her next assignment, knowing that she had not only saved 500 Allied personnel, but had also changed how the military thought about talent, loyalty, and the courage required to act when institutional procedures failed to meet the demands of operational reality. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.